Hello and welcome to another video trying to get you the very top grades. I'm going to begin this one by showing you how to compare the poems for a grade 5 and 6 and then show you why you need a different method to get grades 7, 8 and 9 in choosing your comparisons. I'll show you why planning your comparisons around the poet's purpose is going to get you the top grades every time. Then I'll show you the other way to get the top grades by comparing the poem's form. And then finally, I'll try to answer this question: what's the least number of poems you can revise for the exam? Okay, well, at grades 5 to 6, the words clear comparisons appear in the mark scheme. So probably the most popular way to choose which poems to compare is to pick them by topic, whichever cluster you're doing. So for example, you would put those about war together, or those about people in a crisis together, or those about romantic love and so on, love between friends and family, those about nature or love of place or the past. Now you can plan those in advance, but I'm giving you an extra tip here of trying to use a 19th century poem, as this will always help you write about form and structure. Very often the poem that you get presented with in the exam paper might not have an obvious form and structure, or you might pick a 20th century poem that doesn't have an obvious form and structure, and unless you write about those two, you can't really get a decent grade 7. But if you want a better grade, the examiners have this phrase: they want a thoughtful comparison. Now, how do you show that your comparison is thoughtful? So if we go back to just the clear comparison, picking poems by topic isn't necessarily thoughtful. Well, it can't be, because they're obvious. Oh look, here are 2 war poems. Oh look, here are 2 poems about people in love. There's nothing thoughtful about that, is there? So if you're going to try to show the examiner you're being thoughtful, you really have to write about the writer's ideas, the poet's ideas. Now the good news is that actually, I think, makes your revision much more interesting, because you're going to link them by idea. So I'll show you an example from Love and Relationships and then go to the Power and Conflict and show you an example there. So let's imagine I've got Porphyria's lover here. So this is about a man and a woman, both of whom are in love with each other. And I could compare that to another love poem that was similar. So When We Two Parted is also about a male and a female lover, and the relationship ends as it does here. So a simple, clear comparison would be to compare those 2 poems. But if I want to write about how the poet wants to deal with the role of women in a patriarchal society, then I might choose differently. I would still choose the same poems, but I've got a completely different kind of comparison. It's about the writer's ideas, the poet's ideas. And so here we've got patriarchal society where this female lover seems to have thrown off Lord Byron for a more powerful lover, and in this poem we have a male lover who wants to be more powerful than his socially superior female lover and therefore kills her. So I've got some interesting comparisons there. But what if I want to argue that my poet's purpose is to make us sympathise with the male? Well, now I've got a different one, because we don't sympathise with the male here at all, but we do in a very nuanced way in The Farmer's Bride. Here we sympathise a lot with the farmer who's married, although we worry about him and whether he fully appreciates what's going to happen to the bride. Well, similarly, we're invited to be sympathetic by Lord Byron to himself, because he's the persona in the poem, but we also might have feelings of unease about the male persona in the poem. Now, this is a much more interesting comparison, because Lord Byron didn't want us to have this unease about the male persona because it's him. However, Charlotte Mew does want us to have this sense of unease about the male persona in The Farmer's Bride. So now I've got a much more interesting comparison that I can make around the writer's ideas. So I hope you can see that picking the right poems to compare will force me to be thoughtful, which will then force me to write at a level that's going to get me at least a grade 7. And I keep using that word force, but it's true. It will force the examiner to keep asking, oh look, do I need to give this candidate at least a grade 7? So let's look at the power and conflict cluster now, and imagine that my choice was to write about war poems. So Kamikaze is a poem about how a family deals with the after effects of war. War Photographer is about how a photographer and the general public deal with the after effects of war. Remains is about how a soldier deals with the after effects of war. So I might automatically think, great, these three are brilliant to revise together. They compare really well. Well, they do. They are very clear comparisons, which are going to get me up to a grade 6. But they all ignore the writer's ideas about the effects of war, yeah? To say that the war has an after effect is not really an idea. It's like saying, because today is Friday, you're probably looking forward to the weekend. Well, yeah, that's obvious, isn't it? It's not an idea. Now I can spend some better time in my revision then, thinking about what the poet's idea is in the poem. So, Kamikaze explores the idea of a culture which celebrates loyalty to higher ideals, like patriotism and self-sacrifice. The society in the poem has a cult of death, which is more powerful than love. So hopefully you're familiar with this kind of writing I ask you to do. It's called a thesis, where you put forward an argument about the text that you're reading. And you'll notice that I have at least 2 parts to my thesis, because I'm trying to think in real depth about the poem. It doesn't take me ages, it's just 2 sentences, but I've really thought through why I think the poet is writing that. What ideas are they exploring? Now, if I have to choose a war poem, because the question might ask me to write about war, the better choice is now Poppies, not the ones that I showed you before. Why? Well, Poppies is also about the cult of patriotism. The boy goes off to war to fight for his country, and it's taken the mother's son to war. This was more important to the son than his love of life or love of family. And so you can see that these are now linked by similar ideas. Now I can have a thoughtful comparison where I contrast the mother's grief at his death in Poppies with the Kamikaze's family's grief at the father and husband's survival. And I can ask if they are both anti-war poems, or do they argue that a culture is worth dying for? And therefore are they poems ultimately in celebration of war? Now that is a thoughtful comparison. It's really making me think. Well, if it's making me think, it must be a thoughtful comparison, and that's a really good guide for you. Okay, well, let's imagine it's not war that's in the title, the question, but the question's about conflict. Well, then I might choose my last Duchess. Let's have a look at my thesis. Here, the self-sacrifice is the wife's, the Duchess, both the original Duchess and the Count's daughter who's going to be his next wife. Here, the ideal isn't patriotism, but patriarchy and satisfying male power. Remember, the Duke represents male power, and he is the great power in the land. He's the Duke, and therefore he represents the patriarchy. They have to satisfy both the Duke and their own fathers, because it's their fathers who are choosing to marry them off to the Duke in this kind of financial arrangement, and they've arranged the marriage. There is a cult in this one, but the cult is to the subservience to male power, and it's preserved through the Duke's patronage of artists who are all men, so Frau Pandolf and Claus of Innsbruck, male artists, and their job is to portray women in subservient ways. If you think about the portrait of the last Duchess blushing, there she is subservient. If you think about the statue of Neptune and the seahorses who are feminized in this poem, and they are also subservient to the male. Now I can make some really interesting comparisons to Poppies and ask if the mother's female power must be subservient to the son's male power. And so her power as a mother is not enough to overcome his power as a male and the cult of patriotism. and the cult of the patriarchy, men protecting women, protecting society, and so on. Or I can choose to compare it to Kamikaze. So I can ask if both poems are critical of the society they describe. Yes, they are. And if they both want to change ideas of manhood. Perhaps they do. Is the Duke's killing of his wife the same as Japanese society's killing of its pilots? In both cases, we could argue that it's society that condones these deaths. And obviously that's going to make your essay much more original than other students, which is another way to get the top grades. Now, I'm also going to encourage you to write about a 20th century poem because it's got the extra superpower of form. So all the 1900 poems, or those written before 1918, all have a really strong form, whichever cluster you're studying. And the top grades ask you to write about form. When you look at the 20th century poems, you will often find that there isn't an obvious form, and you will just find it impossible to get the top marks. It's not your fault, although it is, because you will have chosen the wrong poem. Now, remember, in your essay, you have to write about form. If one of your poems doesn't have it, then you make a point about why it doesn't have a form. You'll still get the marks by writing about the one that does have a form. So what's the least you can revise? Well, if you're really tight for time, then I would encourage you just to revise the poems that are written before 1918, because if you've got those, you know they will fit any question, and obviously you can compare two of them. If one of them pops up in the exam, you've got another one to compare it to. So my top bit of advice, if you're not revising all of the poems, and I'm not saying you shouldn't revise them all, by the way, but if you're not, then you should revise the ones written before 1918. And then my next bit of advice is, when you're revising those poems, is to follow my teaching on the Foss way, which shows you how to write about just 5 quotations, or even as few as 4, because one of your points in the Foss way is actually about form. So remember, if you want to get higher than a grade 5 and 6, don't just pick the obvious clear comparison about theme or subject matter. Go for the thoughtful comparison, which is always about the poet's ideas. If you've liked what I've presented you here, these are all extracts from my guide to the literature exam, which you can buy or not. But either way, see you soon on my channel.